Welcome. But before we begin tonight's journey into history, pause for a moment and think carefully about this question. How does a people once saved by mercy eventually become crushed by slavery? How does a family welcomed into the greatest kingdom of the ancient world later become hunted, oppressed, and broken beneath the feet of tyrants? And perhaps most terrifying of all, how can freedom disappear so slowly that an entire generation forgets what freedom even looked like? Tonight, we uncover one of the most emotional and powerful transformations recorded in the Quran. The story of how freedom turned into slavery. The story of Bani Israel in Egypt. A story not merely about politics or kings, but about fear, power, memory, oppression, and the fragile nature of human freedom. Long before chains tightened around their hands, before soldiers stormed their homes, before mothers hid newborn children in silence, Bani Israel arrived in Egypt as honored guests. Their story began not with slavery, but with rescue. The ancient world was collapsing beneath famine. The lands of Canaan had become dry and merciless. Rain disappeared, fields died, animals collapsed from hunger. Entire tribes wandered desperately searching for survival. And in the middle of that catastrophe stood an aging prophet, Yaqub alayhi salam, a father tested by grief yet sustained by faith. Years earlier, his beloved son Yusuf alayhi salam had disappeared after being betrayed by his own brothers. Thrown into a well, sold into slavery, taken far away into Egypt. To human eyes, it looked like tragedy, but Allah was preparing destiny. Inside Egypt, Yusuf alayhi salam endured years of hardship, false accusations, prison, isolation. Yet through patience and trust in Allah, he eventually rose to extraordinary authority within the Egyptian kingdom. Then came the famine, a famine so devastating that surrounding nations faced collapse. But Egypt survived because Allah had granted Yusuf wisdom to prepare years in advance. Massive grain reserves protected the kingdom while neighboring lands starved. And so caravans from every direction began traveling toward Egypt seeking food. Among them came the brothers of Yusuf, the same brothers who once abandoned him in darkness. And there, inside the heart of Egypt itself, history changed forever. Yusuf forgave them. Not only forgave them, he invited his entire family to settle in Egypt under royal protection. This was the hidden beginning of Bani Israel in Egypt. Not conquerors, not invaders, not rulers, refugees, survivors escaping famine. The ruler of Egypt welcomed them because of Yusuf's position and honor. They settled in fertile lands near the Nile Delta, where water flowed generously and livestock could survive. For the first time in years, there was peace. Children no longer cried from hunger. Families rebuilt their lives. Homes expanded. Generations were born. And slowly, the descendants of Yaqub multiplied. At first, Egypt represented safety, a sanctuary beneath the protection of a grateful kingdom. But history never stands still. The generation that knew Yusuf eventually died. The rulers who remembered his service disappeared. New kings rose to power, kings with no emotional connection to Yusuf, no gratitude, no memory. And when memory dies, fear often replaces it. The population of Bani Israel continued growing rapidly. Their communities expanded across the land. What once appeared as a small migrant family had now become a visible and significant population inside Egypt itself. And throughout history, powerful governments have often feared large minority populations, especially populations with strong identity, family structure, and rapid growth. Questions began spreading through the Egyptian elite. What if they become too powerful? What if enemies invade and Bani Israel side against us? What if one day they challenge Egyptian authority? Fear began poisoning politics. And fear has always been one of the most dangerous forces in human civilization, because fearful rulers rarely choose justice. They choose control. The Egyptian leadership slowly transformed Bani Israel from guests into threats. Suspicion became policy. Policy became oppression. At first, the changes may have seemed small. Additional labor requirements, restrictions, harsh treatment, economic pressure. But oppression rarely announces itself all at once. It grows gradually, like darkness swallowing light. One generation notices discomfort. The next generation experiences fear. The generation after that accepts suffering as normal life. And this is how freedom disappears. Slowly, quietly, systematically, until people born into chains no longer understand what liberty ever meant. The descendants of Yaqub alayhi salam eventually became forced laborers beneath the expanding Egyptian empire. Ancient traditions describe massive construction projects requiring endless human effort. Bricks baked beneath scorching heat, stone dragged across deserts, laborers collapsing from exhaustion, and among those workers stood Bani Israel. The people once welcomed into Egypt for protection, now crushed beneath Egyptian authority. Imagine the emotional pain of that transformation, grandparents remembering freedom, while grandchildren inherit slavery. Stories passed quietly from generation to generation. There was once a time before this. There was once dignity. There was once honor. But memories fade when suffering lasts too long, and perhaps that is one of the darkest aspects of oppression. Not merely physical suffering, but psychological destruction. When tyrants dominate people long enough, they attempt to reshape identity itself, to convince the oppressed that weakness is natural, that humiliation is permanent, that resistance is impossible. And Pharaoh understood this very well. The Quran describes how Firaun divided society and weakened groups he considered dangerous. He ruled through fear, through intimidation, through control. But one thing terrified him more than anything else: numbers. Bani Israel continued multiplying despite hardship. Families continued growing despite oppression. And tyrants throughout history have always feared populations they cannot fully control. Then came the decree that transformed oppression into horror: the killing of newborn sons. Imagine hearing such an order spread across the land. Imagine mothers freezing in terror. Imagine fathers unable to protect their own children. Egyptian soldiers entering homes searching for infant boys. Crying mothers hiding babies in darkness. Entire communities living beneath constant fear. This was no longer simple slavery. This was psychological warfare against an entire people. A campaign designed to weaken Bani Israel permanently. The boys would be killed. The girls spared. A policy built upon cruelty and fear. And yet, history reveals something astonishing. The more tyrants attempt to destroy truth, the closer they often move toward their own destruction. Because during this very period of terror, Allah caused another child to be born, a child destined to confront Pharaoh himself, Musa alayhi salam. But before Musa would stand before kings, before miracles split the sea, before revelation descended upon Mount Sinai, he was simply a newborn child hidden by a frightened mother. Imagine her fear. Every knock at the door carrying terror, every sound outside bringing panic. Then Allah inspired her with an unimaginable command: place the baby into the river. Trust me, to human logic it seemed impossible. How could a river protect what soldiers threatened to kill? But divine wisdom operates beyond human understanding. The basket carrying infant Musa drifted across the Nile, until it arrived at the palace of Pharaoh himself. The very ruler attempting to destroy Bani Israel unknowingly raised the child who would challenge his empire. History is filled with irony, but few moments compare to this. Inside the palace, Musa grew surrounded by Egyptian royalty while secretly belonging to the oppressed people beneath them. He witnessed two worlds: the world of power and the world of suffering. Years later, after fleeing Egypt and living in exile, Musa received revelation from Allah near Mount Sinai. There, Allah commanded him to return to Egypt, not as a fugitive, not as a frightened man, but as a prophet, a messenger sent to confront tyranny itself. Imagine the courage required for such a mission: to stand before the mightiest ruler of the age, armed not with armies, but with truth. Musa returned alongside his brother Harun alayhi salam. They called Pharaoh toward justice, toward humility, toward worshiping Allah alone. But tyrants intoxicated by power rarely surrender easily. Pharaoh mocked them. He denied the signs. He accused Musa of sorcery. Yet Allah supported Musa with miracles impossible to ignore: the staff transforming into a serpent, the shining hand, signs shaking the confidence of Egypt itself. Even Pharaoh's magicians recognized the truth when they witnessed the miracle. And something extraordinary happened. The magicians fell into prostration before Allah. Imagine that moment. Men who once served Pharaoh publicly abandoning him before the entire kingdom. Truth shattered fear, and Pharaoh reacted exactly as tyrants always do when power slips away: with rage, threats, violence, execution. But once faith enters the heart, fear begins losing control. Eventually, Allah commanded Musa to lead Bani Israel out of Egypt. After generations of slavery, freedom stood before them once more. Imagine that night, families quietly preparing to flee, whispers spreading through exhausted communities, hope mixing with fear. Then the journey began. Bani Israel moved through darkness, carrying generations of suffering behind them. But Pharaoh pursued them with his armies, and finally they reached the sea. Before them, water. Behind them, death. The people panicked. Some believed the end had come, but Musa alayhi salam stood firm. My Lord is with me. And then history witnessed one of its greatest miracles. By Allah's command, the sea split open. Walls of water rose like mountains. A pathway emerged across the seabed. Bani Israel crossed toward freedom while Pharaoh's armies charged behind them. And when the last believer crossed safely, the sea returned. The empire that once enslaved generations disappeared beneath the water. Pharaoh, who declared himself divine, was destroyed by the very creation he could never control. And just like that, slavery ended. But the deeper lesson remained. Because freedom is never merely physical, a people enslaved for generations carry wounds beyond chains. Fear, trauma, dependency, psychological scars. And the Quran shows that even after liberation, Bani Israel struggled emotionally and spiritually from the effects of centuries beneath oppression. This is what long-term tyranny does to human beings. It reshapes behavior, weakens confidence, distorts thinking. And perhaps that is why this story remains eternally relevant. Because the transformation from freedom into slavery, and from slavery back into freedom, is not ancient history alone. It is a warning for humanity. Civilizations often believe freedom is permanent, but history says otherwise. Nations rise, nations weaken, rights disappear gradually, fear expands quietly, and generations later, people suddenly realize they have inherited chains their ancestors once escaped. That is why the Quranic story of Bani Israel in Egypt matters so deeply. It is not merely about one people. It is about the fragile nature of justice itself, the danger of forgetting gratitude, the danger of power without morality, the danger of fear-driven politics. And above all, it is about the certainty that no tyranny lasts forever, because every pharaoh eventually falls. Every empire built upon oppression eventually cracks. And every oppressed people who place their trust in Allah eventually discover that darkness never survives forever. The winds that once carried the cries of enslaved generations across Egypt's deserts eventually carried something else instead: freedom. And that freedom was born not through kings, not through wealth, not through armies, but through faith in Allah